At 78, Edward Kingsley's body was frail, but his spirit burned with an unfulfilled yearning. With only months to live, he embarked on his final journey to Bali, a place he had dreamt of since his youth. Amidst ancient temples and lush jungles, he discovered an ornate relic buried in the roots of a sacred tree. The artifact shimmered as if alive, bending reality itself with its presence. Unbeknownst to Edward, unlocking its secrets would lead him on an adventure that defied time, space, and mortality. Edward Kingsley sat alone in his dimly lit study, the room filled with the smell of old books and fading memories. At 78, his once strong hands trembled as they traced the edges of an old postcard from Bali, one he had kept hidden for decades. It showed a stunning sunset over rice terraces with a handwritten note on the back. "Find what you've lost, and you'll find yourself." S. The sender had long since vanished from his life, but the words had haunted him ever since. The postcard was from Sarah, the love of his youth, who had mysteriously disappeared when they were just beginning to build their lives together. Bali had been their shared dream, a place they planned to visit to explore its beauty and mysticism, but life had pulled them apart, and Edward never mustered the courage to follow through on their dream alone. Now, with his body ravaged by illness and his time running out, he felt an undeniable pull toward the island that had lingered in his imagination. Packing for the journey was a ritual in itself. Edward carefully folded a few shirts, a journal, and a worn copy of a Balinese mythology book he had bought years ago. He left behind most of his possessions, keeping only what mattered. His doctor had advised against such a strenuous trip, but Edward had made up his mind. "Better to die chasing a dream than waiting for it to come true," he muttered, his voice a mix of determination and resignation. The flight to Bali was long and exhausting, but Edward's heart quickened as he stepped off the plane into the warm, fragrant air of the island. The sounds of bustling markets, chirping cicadas, and distant waves greeted him. Despite the fatigue, he felt more alive than he had in years. A driver, holding a sign with his name, led him to a modest guest house in Ubud, nestled among emerald-green rice fields. On his first morning, Edward awoke to the soft glow of sunlight filtering through bamboo blinds. The guest-house owner, a kind woman named Nyoman, served him a traditional Balinese breakfast of nasi goreng and fresh papaya. She seemed to sense his purpose without him saying a word. "You've come here for something important," she said, her voice gentle but knowing. Edward nodded but remained silent, unsure how to explain a lifetime of regret and longing. Nyoman directed him to a local guide named Kadek, a man in his 30s with an easy smile and an encyclopedic knowledge of Balinese culture. "He will show you the places you need to see," she assured Edward. Kadek greeted him warmly and asked, "What is it you're looking for, Mr. Kingsley?" Edward hesitated before replying. "I'm not entirely sure. Something lost, I suppose." Their first destination was Tirta Empul, a sacred water temple known for its cleansing rituals. Edward watched as worshippers bathed in the crystal-clear pools, their faces serene and full of hope. Kadek explained the significance of the ritual, washing away impurities to begin anew. Edward felt a pang of envy for their faith, their certainty. He dipped his hands into the water, the coolness a stark contrast to the fire of his thoughts. Later, they visited Goa Gaja, the elephant cave, a place steeped in mystery and ancient energy. Edward marveled at the intricate carvings and the sense of timelessness that enveloped the site. Kadek told him stories of the cave's history, its connection to Hinduism and Buddhism, and the balance of light and dark it represented. Edward listened intently, feeling a strange connection to the themes of duality and renewal. As the days passed, Edward felt a subtle transformation. The beauty of Bali, the kindness of its people, and the depth of its culture began to chip away at the walls he had built around himself. He found solace in the island's rhythm, its blend of chaos and tranquility. But one night, As he sat on the veranda of his guest house, staring at the stars, he felt the weight of his unfinished business pressing down on him. "Why now?" he whispered to the night. "Why did it take me so long to come here?" The stars offered no answers, but in the silence he felt a flicker of resolve. He knew he hadn't come to Bali just to reminisce. Something deeper was calling him, something that felt both familiar and otherworldly. The next morning, Nyoman handed him a small wrapped package. "This came for you," she said with a curious look. Inside was a simple note. "Go to the tree where the spirits rest. S." Edward's heart raced as he realized the handwriting was unmistakably Sarah's. Could she still be alive? Or was this some final message left for him to discover? The question ignited a fire in him, one that he hadn't felt in decades. He knew then that his journey was far from over. That evening, Edward sat with Caddick under the glow of lanterns at a small roadside cafe. "Caddick, do you know of a place where the spirits are said to rest?" he asked, his voice trembling with anticipation. Caddick's expression grew serious. "There is a tree, deep in the forest, near an abandoned temple. Locals believe it is a sacred place, where the veil between our world and the spirit world is thin, but it is not a place one visits lightly. Are you certain?" Edward's determination was unshaken. "I have to." The following day, Edward and Caddick set out before dawn, their journey leading them through dense jungles and along winding paths. The air grew heavier, the atmosphere charged with an otherworldly energy. As they approached the tree, Edward felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. The tree was massive, its roots sprawling like the fingers of an ancient giant. At its base lay a small altar, adorned with offerings of flowers and incense. Edward knelt before it, his heart pounding as he whispered, "Sarah, what am I meant to find here?" The wind swirled around him, the leaves rustling as though they were alive. Edward opened his eyes to see Caddick standing a few steps back, his expression unreadable. Edward turned back to the altar and found a small golden pendant resting atop it, shaped like an eye with a vibrant gemstone at its center. His hands trembled as he picked it up, the pendant warm against his palm. "What is this?" Edward asked, his voice barely audible. Caddick stepped closer. "They call it the Mata Jiwa, the eye of the soul. It is said to reveal what lies hidden within you and what you seek." Edward stared at the pendant, his reflection shimmering in the gemstone. He felt the weight of it, not just in his hand, but in his heart. For the first time, he realized his journey was just beginning. Edward knelt at the base of the ancient tree, his hands trembling as they brushed against its gnarled roots. The air was dense, heavy with the scent of earth and incense left by past visitors. Caddick stood nearby, his expression unreadable, as though the forest itself demanded reverence. Edward unfolded the note again, his eyes scanning Sarah's words. "Go to the tree where the spirits rest." The message offered no guidance, only questions. Why had Sarah sent him here? Was she still alive? Caddick finally broke the silence. "This tree is called the Pohon Jiwa, the Tree of Souls. The locals believe it listens, but only to those who are truly ready." Edward looked up at the towering trunk, its branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal arms. "And if I'm not ready?" he asked. Caddick's gaze was steady. "Then it will remain silent." Edward placed his hands on the bark. It was cool, alive, with an almost imperceptible hum. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Sarah, if you're here, show me." The forest held its breath. For a moment, there was only the rustling of leaves. Then, faintly, a melody emerged, a soft, haunting tune, carried on the wind. Edward's eyes flew open. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Caddick frowned. "Hear what?" The melody grew louder, pulling Edward to his feet. He followed it instinctively, leaving Caddick behind. The forest grew darker with each step, the trees closing in like silent sentinels. But Edward felt no fear. only an unshakable urge to keep going. The music tugged at something deep within him, a memory he couldn't grasp. After what felt like hours, he stumbled into a clearing. At its center stood a shrine, its stone walls covered in moss and carvings. The melody stopped abruptly. Inside, on a pedestal, lay a golden pendant shaped like an eye, its center a gem that seemed to hold a universe within. Edward hesitated, his hand hovering above it. "Don't touch it," Caddick's voice cut through the stillness. Edward turned to see his guide at the edge of the clearing, his expression serious. "What is it?" Edward asked. Caddick approached cautiously. "It is called Mata Jiwa, the Eye of Souls. It is said to see into the past, present, and future, but it can bring great pain to those who are unworthy." Edward's fingers trembled. "What does it mean to be worthy?" Caddick shrugged. "Only the spirits know." But Edward wasn't listening. The pendant called to him with an almost magnetic pull. Ignoring Caddick's warning, he picked it up. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of colors, swirling and shifting like a dream, unraveling. Edward felt himself falling, tumbling through time and space. When the chaos stopped, he found himself in a familiar place, a small cafe in London decades earlier. His younger self sat at a table by the window, laughing with Sarah. The sight took his breath away. Edward tried to call out, but no sound escaped his lips. He was merely a spectator, trapped in the memory. Sarah's face was radiant, her laughter like music. Edward watched, his heart aching with a bittersweet mix of joy and regret. This was the day she had given him the postcard, the same one that had brought him to Bali. He had forgotten how happy they had been. But the memory shifted. The cafe dissolved, replaced by another scene, an argument in their apartment. Sarah was packing a suitcase, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand," she said. "I have to go. It's not just about us." Edward watched helplessly as his younger self stood frozen. The pain of that moment hit him anew, as raw and devastating as it had been all those years ago. The vision ended abruptly. Edward was back in the clearing, the pendant clutched tightly in his hand. Caddick stood over him, his expression a mix of concern and frustration. "I told you not to touch it," Caddick said. Edward barely heard him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had seen. "It showed me," he began, but the words failed him. Caddick sighed. "The eye doesn't show what you want. It shows what you need, but its truths are not always easy to bear." Edward stared at the pendant, its golden surface now dull. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Caddick's tone softened. "You came here seeking answers. Maybe it's time you ask the right questions." Edward nodded, his gaze fixed on the pendant. For the first time, he understood that this journey wasn't just about finding Sarah, it was about finding himself. As they made their way back to the guest house, Edward felt a strange sense of clarity. The visions had reopened old wounds, but they had also reminded him of the life he had lived, and the life he still had left. Whatever lay ahead, he felt ready to face it. Back in his room, Edward placed the pendant on the bedside table, its dull surface catching the moonlight. He didn't know what the next step would be, but a flicker of hope stirred within him. The journey was far from over. The morning sun filtered through the bamboo blinds, casting intricate patterns on the wooden floor. Edward sat at the edge of his bed, the pendant heavy in his hands. Its golden surface was dull, the gem at its center lifeless. He traced its edges with his thumb, replaying the visions it had shown him, the love, the laughter, and the heartbreak that had defined his past. Each memory felt like a wound reopening, a reminder of the choices he had made and the opportunities he had let slip away. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. Caddick stepped inside, his expression calm but filled with curiosity. "Did you sleep?" he asked. Edward shook his head. "How could I? The pendant keeps showing me everything I failed to do. Every moment I let her down." His voice was heavy with regret, and his eyes betrayed the exhaustion of carrying a lifetime of unanswered questions. Kadek leaned against the doorframe. The eye doesn't lie, but it doesn't tell the whole story either. It shows what you need to see, not what you want. Edward frowned. But why show me that? I came here to find Sarah, not relive my failures. Kadek approached and placed a hand on Edward's shoulder. Sometimes, to move forward, you need to face what's behind you. Maybe the eye is telling you to confront your past, not just escape it. Edward sighed deeply, feeling the weight of Kadek's words. As much as he wanted to argue, he couldn't shake the sense that his guide was right. By late morning, the two men set out for a remote village in the hills. Kadek had arranged a meeting with a local elder, Lu Ayu, who was said to understand the mysteries of the Mata Jiwa. The road was long, cutting through dense forests and terraced rice fields glistening under the sun. Edward, though weary, couldn't help but admire the beauty around him. The vibrant greens of the landscape and the rhythmic chirping of cicadas seemed to whisper secrets of the island's timeless spirit. The village they arrived at seemed untouched by time. Wooden houses with thatched roofs lined the narrow paths, and the villagers moved with a calm rhythm that spoke of lives unhurried. Children played by a small stream, their laughter echoing through the air, while elders sat weaving intricate patterns into cloths. Kadek led Edward to a small hut at the edge of the settlement. Inside, an elderly woman sat weaving. Her hands moved deftly, the patterns she created seemingly alive with meaning. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, lifted as they approached. "This is Edward," Kadek introduced, bowing respectfully. Lu Ayu studied Edward, her gaze lingering on the pendant in his hands. "The eye has found you," she said simply, her voice firm yet gentle. Edward hesitated, unsure of how to begin. "I don't know why it came to me. It showed me painful memories. I don't understand what it wants," he admitted, his voice laced with frustration. Lu Ayu nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "The Mata Jiwa is not just an artifact. It is a mirror of the soul. It reveals truths we often hide from ourselves, but its power is not without price." She leaned closer, her eyes locking with Edward's. "The visions are only the beginning. The eye will test you. If you wish to uncover its secrets, you must endure its trials." Edward's stomach tightened. "What kind of trials?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lu Ayu didn't answer directly. Instead, she handed him a piece of cloth, its intricate patterns woven with symbols he didn't recognize. "This is a map," she explained, "but it will only guide you when the time is right." Edward accepted it, puzzled by her cryptic words. As they left the hut, Kadek remained quiet, sensing Edward's unease. The pendant in Edward's hand felt heavier than ever, as though it carried not just his past, but the weight of the journey ahead. By the time they returned to the guest house, Edward was too exhausted to think. He placed the pendant and the cloth on the bedside table, staring at them as if they might offer answers on their own. That night, sleep came fitfully, plagued by dreams of shadowy temples and faint voices calling his name. He saw flashes of Sarah, her face both vivid and elusive, and glimpses of places he didn't recognize. Ancient carvings, rushing waterfalls, and the glow of candlelit rituals. When he woke in the early hours of the morning, drenched in sweat, he realized that the journey wasn't just about finding Sarah. It was about confronting everything he had avoided for so long, his fears, his regrets, and his own sense of worth. Unfolding the cloth map, Edward stared at its symbols. At first, it seemed meaningless, a chaotic tangle of lines and shapes, but as he studied it, a pattern emerged. The lines converged into a path leading to a temple marked with a symbol resembling the pendant. He showed it to Kadek, who nodded in recognition. "Taman Ayun," Kadek said, "a place of balance and renewal, but it's not easy to reach." Edward tightened his grip on the map. "Then we'd better get started," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of purpose. The trials ahead were uncertain, but Edward knew one thing. He was ready to face them. Edward and Caddick left the guest house at dawn, the horizon painted in hues of orange and pink. The pendant hung heavy around Edward's neck, its dull golden surface pressing against his chest. The cloth map had directed them toward Taman Ayun, a temple of balance and harmony. Caddick had warned that the journey would be long and fraught with challenges, both physical and spiritual. The forest was alive with the rustling of leaves, the calls of unseen birds, and the faint hum of insects. Edward's thoughts churned as they walked. The visions from the pendant replayed in his mind. Sarah's radiant laughter, her tears, and the unbearable regret of letting her go. Was Sarah truly his destination, or had she become something else, a symbol of the answers he was too afraid to seek? Caddick broke the silence. Taman Ayun isn't just a temple. It's a place of transformation. Many come seeking answers, but only those willing to face the truth leave with them. Edward frowned. And those who aren't ready? Caddick gave a faint smile. They leave carrying the same burdens they arrived with. The air grew heavier as the path steepened. Roots and jagged rocks jutted from the ground, threatening to trip unwary travelers. Caddick moved with practiced ease, but Edward stumbled, his breath coming in short, labored gasps. He paused to lean against a tree, wiping sweat from his brow. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. Caddick handed him a flask of water. "The journey challenges more than your body. It tests your will. If you stop now, you'll carry these unanswered questions forever. Is that the life you want?" Edward shook his head, gripping the flask tightly. After a long drink, he pushed himself upright. "Let's keep going." The dense jungle eventually opened to reveal a ridge overlooking a lush valley. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills blanketed in green, with a river winding like a silver ribbon far below. But Edward barely noticed. His focus was on the temple in the distance, its spires piercing the sky like ancient sentinels. They reached a massive stone gate, carved with intricate symbols of mythical creatures and sacred stories. Caddick stopped and turned to Edward. "This is where I leave you," he said. Edward's stomach tightened. "You're not coming." Caddick shook his head. "The trials inside are yours alone. I'll wait here." Edward wanted to protest but saw no hesitation in Caddick's eyes. Swallowing his fear, he nodded and stepped through the gate. Inside, the air was cool and heavy, carrying an almost palpable sense of power. The path led to a courtyard where 4 statues surrounded a central altar: a warrior, a scholar, a child, and an elder. The pendant against Edward's chest grew warm, its faint pulse quickening as though it sensed the energy of the place. Edward approached the altar with cautious steps. A deep, resonant voice echoed. "Why have you come?" it asked. Edward froze, looking around but seeing no one. "I'm searching for answers," he said. "For Sarah." The voice sighed, its sound reverberating in his chest. "To find what you seek, you must first release what you carry." The statues began to glow faintly, their features sharpening as though they were alive. "You carry fear, regret, and doubt. Lay them down, and you may proceed." Edward's hands trembled as he touched the pendant. "How do I lay them down?" he whispered. The warrior statue stepped forward, its eyes fierce and unyielding. "Face your fear," it commanded. The courtyard dissolved. Edward stood on the edge of a crumbling cliff, a black chasm yawning below. A voice whispered, "Jump!" Panic surged through him. "I can't," he cried. The ground gave way, forcing him to leap. Instead of falling, he felt himself lifted, as though carried by unseen hands. The darkness faded, and he was back in the courtyard. The warrior nodded and returned to its pedestal. The scholar stepped forward next, its gaze wise and penetrating. "Face your regret," it said. The scene shifted. Edward was in his apartment, watching his younger self argue with Sarah. He wanted to intervene, to scream at his younger self to stop her from leaving, but he could only watch. "Regret doesn't change the past," the scholar's voice said. "What have you learned?" Edward's voice cracked. "That I should have fought for her, that I let her go." The scholar nodded. "Then fight now." The vision dissolved, and Edward found himself in the courtyard once more. Finally, the child and the elder approached together. "Face your doubt," they said in unison. Edward found himself in a mirrored room, his reflections shifting. Some showed him as strong, others as weak, brave, or fearful. "Which are you?" the voices asked. "I don't know," Edward admitted. The reflections faded, leaving one, the man he was now. "Then choose," the voices urged. Edward reached out and touched the glass. "I choose to move forward." The mirror shattered, and he was back in the courtyard. The statues returned to their pedestals, their glow fading. The voice spoke once more. "You have laid down your burdens. Proceed." The pendant around Edward's neck grew cold, its weight lighter. A door behind the altar creaked open, revealing stairs descending into darkness. Edward glanced back toward the gate. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward into the unknown. Edward descended the spiral staircase, each step taking him deeper into the unknown. The air grew colder with every step, carrying the damp scent of earth and stone. The faint glow of the pendant around his neck cast long, flickering shadows on the walls, its light pulsing steadily like a heartbeat. The silence was heavy, broken only by the echo of his footsteps. Each step seemed to draw him further from the world he knew, yet he pressed on, driven by a resolve he couldn't fully explain. Finally, the stairs ended, and he stepped into a vast cavern. The space was enormous, its high ceilings lost in shadow. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of incense and stone. In the center of the cavern stood a massive stone altar, flanked by two towering statues. Each statue held a staff, the tips glowing faintly. The space felt alive, charged with an energy that seemed to hum in his chest. Edward approached cautiously, his footsteps deliberate. As he neared the altar, the pendant around his neck began to glow brighter, its warmth spreading against his chest. The statue's eyes flickered to life, their golden light matching the pendant's glow. The ground trembled softly, and a deep, resonant voice filled the cavern, reverberating in his chest. "You have come far," it said, "but your journey is not yet complete." Edward stopped before the altar, his voice trembling. "What more do you want from me? I've faced my fears, my regrets, and my doubts. Isn't that enough?" The voice softened, its tone almost compassionate. "What you have faced was only the beginning. What lies ahead is not a trial of the past, but of the present. Are you prepared to see the truth?" Edward swallowed hard. "I didn't come this far to turn back." The altar began to glow, its light spilling across the cavern in swirling patterns. Edward shielded his eyes, the brightness overwhelming. When he lowered his hands, he found himself standing in a lush garden. The air was warm and fragrant, filled with the scent of blooming flowers. A gentle stream wound through the garden, its water sparkling under the golden light of an unseen sun. The tranquility of the scene felt at odds with the tension building in Edward's chest. At the center of the garden, sitting on a stone bench, was a figure. Her back was turned to him, but Edward recognized her instantly. His heart clenched, his breath catching in his throat. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice breaking. The figure turned slowly, and Edward's breath caught. It was her. She looked exactly as he remembered, her hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes bright with warmth and sadness. "Edward," she said softly, her voice carrying across the garden like a melody. "You found me." Edward took a hesitant step forward, his legs feeling weak. "Is it Really you? After all this time? I thought. That I was gone? Sarah interrupted gently, her smile bittersweet. In a way, I was. But I've been waiting, Edward. Waiting for you to find the courage to truly see me. Edward's chest tightened, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Why did you leave? Why didn't you tell me where you were going? Sarah stood, her movements graceful. I left because I needed to, Edward. I wanted you to come after me, to fight for what we had. But you didn't. And so, I waited. Tears welled in Edward's eyes as he shook his head. I was a coward, he admitted. I let you go because I was afraid of failing, afraid of losing you. I thought I was protecting myself, but I see now that I was only running. Sarah stepped closer, her hand brushing against his cheek. Her touch was warm and real, grounding him. You've carried that fear for so long, but you didn't need to. I never wanted perfection, Edward. I only wanted you to try. The garden began to shimmer, its vibrant colors fading as though dissolving into mist. Edward panicked, reaching out for her. No, please don't go. Sarah smiled gently. This isn't goodbye, Edward. It's a beginning. The answers you seek aren't with me. They're within you. The light grew blinding, and when it faded, Edward found himself back in the cavern. He stood alone, the pendant's glow steady but dim. The voice returned, calm and steady. The truth you sought was never about Sarah. It was about yourself. You have faced your fears, embraced your regrets, and overcome your doubts. Now, you are free. Edward's heart ached, but a strange peace began to settle over him. The pendant grew warm once more, its light expanding until it enveloped him completely. When the light faded, Edward found himself standing at the temple's gate. Kydek was there, waiting for him, his expression calm but curious. You've returned, Kydek said simply. Edward nodded, his voice steady. I found her. Or maybe, I found myself. Kydek's gaze softened, his tone carrying quiet understanding. Then your journey has already succeeded. As they began the descent back down the mountain, Edward felt lighter than he had in decades. The trials of the temple had stripped away the burdens he had carried for so long, and revealed truths he could no longer ignore. Yet deep within him, he knew there was one final step left to take, one more truth to uncover. The pendant pulsed faintly against his chest, as though reminding him that the journey was not yet over. The descent from the temple was slow, each step heavy with the weight of what Edward had experienced. Kydek led the way, his steps measured and steady, while Edward followed, his mind caught in a whirlwind of emotions. The jungle around them seemed quieter now, as though the mountain itself held its breath. The pendant around Edward's neck pulsed faintly, its golden glow dim but insistent, a quiet reminder that his journey was not yet complete. When they reached the base of the mountain, the village greeted them with the warm glow of lanterns and the soft hum of evening life. Kydek stopped outside the guest house, turning to face Edward. His expression was calm, his voice low and reflective. The temple has shown you much, Kydek said, but understanding takes time. The answers you seek will reveal themselves when you're ready. Edward nodded, his voice thick. I thought I would find closure, but now I'm not sure what I found. Kydek's gaze softened. Closure is not something the temple gives. It helps you ask the questions that matter. What you do with them, that is up to you. That night, Edward sat on the balcony of the guest house, the pendant resting in his palm. The stars stretched endlessly above him, their faint light reflected in the golden surface of the relic. He traced its edges absently, Sarah's voice echoing in his mind. The answers you seek aren't with me. They're within you. He stared into the night, his thoughts restless. For so long, He had believed that finding Sarah would ease the ache inside him. Now, he wasn't sure what to believe. The next morning, Edward awoke to the sound of birds and the scent of frangipani drifting through the open window. The world outside felt lighter, the air clearer. He dressed quickly, tucking the pendant into his shirt, and stepped out to find Caddick waiting by the gate. "Where will you go today?" Caddick asked. "To the elder," Edward replied. "I need to understand what comes next." Caddick led him through the village, the narrow paths winding between modest homes adorned with intricate carvings. They arrived at a small house near the edge of the village, where an elderly woman sat on the porch, her eyes sharp and wise. Caddick introduced her as Lu Ayu, the village elder. Lu Ayu gestured for Edward to sit, her gaze falling on the pendant. "The Mata Jiwa," she said softly, "the eye of souls. It has chosen you." Edward hesitated. "Why? Why me? What does it want?" Lu Ayu's voice was calm, deliberate. "The eye does not want. It reveals. It has shown you the truths you needed to see, about Sarah, about yourself, but its purpose is not to give you answers. It is to guide you toward the questions that matter." Edward frowned, his fingers tightening around the pendant. "But what am I supposed to do now? I've come so far, but I don't know what to do with what I've learned." Lu Ayu reached out, her hand resting lightly on his. "The eye has freed you from the chains of your past. What you do with that freedom is your choice. The path ahead is yours to decide." Her words settled into Edward's heart, their truth undeniable. For so long, he had searched for Sarah, for closure, for some semblance of resolution. But now he understood. The journey had never been about finding her. It had been about finding himself. In the days that followed, Edward remained in the village, allowing its quiet rhythm to soothe his soul. He walked the narrow paths, spoke with the villagers, and watched the sunrise from the hills. Each moment felt like a step forward, a quiet release of the burdens he had carried for so many years. The pendant stayed with him, a faint glow emanating from its core, a constant reminder of what he had endured and discovered. On his final day in Bali, Edward climbed the mountain one last time. The path to the temple was steep and overgrown, but this time he walked with purpose. When he reached the gate, he paused, his hand resting over the pendant. Its golden light pulsed faintly, as though acknowledging the end of its journey. Edward stepped through the gate and approached the altar where his trials had begun. Slowly, he removed the pendant and placed it on the stone. The light flared briefly, illuminating the temple grounds before fading entirely. As he stepped back, a profound sense of peace washed over him. The pendant had served its purpose, and now, so had he. The journey home was quiet. The weight of regret and pain had been replaced by quiet clarity. Edward no longer searched for answers outside himself. He carried them within, the truths of the temple etched into his soul. When Edward returned to London, the city felt both familiar and new. Rain fell softly as he walked through the streets, his steps lighter than they had been in decades. The memories of Bali remained vivid, a reminder of the transformation he had undergone. As he reached his small apartment, Edward sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. For the first time in his life, Edward felt truly free. The temple had not given him all the answers, but it had shown him how to find them. And as he sat in the quiet of his home, Edward knew his journey was far from over. It was only just beginning.